Disda, hello and welcome again to Kroeder Kroghen. And this week we're going to be talking about Kernewek, or Kernewek Tithiak, traditional Cornish, a slightly different version of Cornish which has been promulgated by a group of speakers who think that traditional Cornish, which is closer to the Cornish spoken as dialect by ordinary Cornish people, should be the Cornish that we should speak, rather than Kernewek Unies or Unified Cornish, or Kernewek phonemic Cornish as it's sometimes called. And I'm joined in the studio by Dick and Jan Gendel and by Neil Kennedy, who are proponents of Kernewek. Dick, how did Kernewek start? What made you decide to pursue this particular pattern of Cornish speaking?
I was taught my first few words of Cornish when I was 4 years old, in 1928. And the Cornish that I was taught then was actually traditional Cornish, Kernewek.
Who were you taught that by?
My mother. If you want to know the details, I was sitting on the loo, and I was taught that to keep me quiet. But that's beside the point. It wasn't until at the end of the war that I got out of the Navy and started taking a deep interest in it. And like everybody else, of course, I was under the spell of Morton Nance and A.S.D. Smith, because they were the two experts of the day. And everybody, of course, followed them. I did too, but I was still interested in traditional Cornish. And it wasn't until about 1972 or so that I got a little bit fed up with Unified, and I left the Cornish scene.
Wel, beth yw'n bras y diffranzo inter Kernewek o Kernewek Tithiak ha Kernewek Unies? Neil?
Well, nag mura difference. So in Cenedlaethus, if you had an point in Cenedlaethus, there's...
It's the same language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's... When son mwy ogas than Sausen at you causes leven in Kernel. In case son marment in case ton lev.
Penwith.
Yeah.
So it's based on essentially Penwith dialect sounds.
Yeah, more or less. It's the point about traditional Cornish is that it makes use of some of the sounds which we can still hear in the dialect of West Cornwall, especially the characteristic intonation and rhythm of speech, which is a feature of West Cornwall.
So, for example, the word that we use in Unified Cornish, or the Cornish that most Cornish speakers learn for house, we have learned to pronounce as chi.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is that because it's pronounced in dialect as chai or even as choi, you now, how do you say the word for house?
We'd say that exactly as you.
Yeah, but it's more than, it's not just dialect, you see, because I mean, way back in the 17th century, it was spelt as if to be pronounced chai. In the Tale of Jew and Shianor, it's C-H-E-I. And Rowe, who lived at the same time, well, at the end of the 17th century, spelt it C-H-O-Y-E. And even before that, it had become choi. It hadn't been chi for a long time.
The argument used by Morton Nance and the others who followed his pattern was that Cornish, modern Cornish, ought to be based on the last time that Cornish was widely used throughout the whole of Cornwall as a language spoken by the majority of the people. And the target date for that, this is Ken George's invention, the idea of a target date, is around 1500. Now, what you're saying is that Cornish should be based on the later Cornish, not around that target date of 1500.
Well, yes, because you see, if you go back to a date when Cornish was spoken by the majority, you've got to go back a long way before 1500, because by 1500 it had gone west of Truro, and most of Cornwall's east of Truro.
And it illustrates the difficulties which someone has if they're trying to advance unified Cornish amongst ordinary Cornish people. It's very difficult for me, it would be very difficult for me, to go along to the class of people I'm teaching in Helston, who've grown up all their lives in that area, and tell them that the place that all their life they've called prayers, they've now got to call prass. Similarly, places like Shiandower, Shianals, if I was to tell them that they've now got to say chi, for those words. I mean, they've grown up with those words.
But you are saying to them they ought to pronounce it choi.
Well, no, not in that position.
No.
That's different in that position. That's unstressed.
Misunderstood.
That's unstressed there.
John, most people listening to this won't be Cornish speakers, and they'll think this is very strange that in such a small language, with such a small number of speakers in any case, that there seems to be a major difference between two groups of people who have apparently very different views about how the language should be spoken. How would you answer them?
I think it's a good sign because it shows that there are enough people with enough knowledge to be able to actually sit down and discuss it and argue and have different opinions.
The fact that there are differences in the way the language is growing is a sign of health, you think?
Yeah.
I think so, yes. It shows that you don't blindly have to follow one leader.
One of the main arguments for Kernewek is this question of continuity, tradition, that you're speaking in a way, as you see it, in a direct line from your grandfathers.
Yeah, certainly. I mean,
I think the thing is that with Kernewek, we're using the latest form of the language with its integrity still there. We're speaking the language in its latest, purest form. We're not changing any grammar, we're not changing any spelling. We have to select, but we choose the purest forms, but we don't change.
Okay, for non-Cornish speakers then, could you give us a brief burst of Kernewek to see what it sounds like?
You Kalish, Neil, Benvedulau.
Well, Norby and Pethel Hell, possibly first table and Peronair.
Kalish,
yeah.
Patherni, Benvedulau Gravis, the Kilsnipis, but.
Can we think this one out?
Is that Agnar?
Is that all you?
Oh.
And
You're on chin on?
Yeah.
Well, I think you're well, for example, two of your programs have covered the story of John of Chior. For comparison, perhaps you could give me the first two lines and I could...
Well, the Nebeth Choir. In termen us passes, a thedja Dane. I can't remember the text.
In Kernewek, in any case, as it was written by John Boson, it would be in terminis pesias there triggers and selevan diana benan in tiller cries chayor in wheel got a scant in meath and diana benan mi ven most of willis wheel the wheel.
So I said pasias and you say
pesias.
Pesias.
It's not.
That's
I mean, not
a small difference.
A small difference, but difference is like the way I said dien.
Dien, as opposed to Dane.
Yeah, well, that's how Louis says it pronounced. He says that round about his time, stressed E's get an A in on the back, and he shows it in his book. So what may have been Dane is Dien. Dien, so
Dien,
yeah.
Dien
And you find Table Mayon down near Land's End. It's spelled M-A-Y-O-N. There's the word. You see Mayon.
Mayon. Okay. Well, I usually end my programs by saying Dugenahui. How is that said in Kernewek?
You say Dubusgeno, or Dugenawe is not so common in later Cornish, but Dubusgeno, or Dubugenes to one person, or Benatugana.
Okay, well, Gomaras. Muras, how do you say that?
Judaladis.
You don't say Muras?
Not so much, no.
No.
Not
Okay,
so much.
well, Ragovi, Muras the Hui, how do you get a
Per there.
Dick Gendel, his wife Jan Gendel, and Neil Kennedy arguing the case for Kernewek. Thanks for coming in. And there's just time left to remind you of the fact that next week is the Cornwall County Music Festival with lots of interesting classes that I hope you'll support, particularly the Cornish language classes, which are to be held next Saturday. That's Cornish-speaking and Cornish singing. And also, just to give you a brief trailer for next week's programme, yesterday was St. Piran's Day, of course, and there was a St. Piran's Day march through the centre of Truro, and I went along and discovered some interesting facts about the patron saint of Cornwall.
Robin Hood was several centuries later than St. Piran, and how little we actually know about him, but how much is written about him and supposed about him, you can see the way these things grow.
So maybe he wasn't a drunken Irishman after all?
I wouldn't like to think so. Nothing against Irishmen, nothing against drunks, come to that. No, it's as a representative of Cornwall as such that we revere him today.
And if you want to know the full story about St. Piran and the St. Piran Day March, then listen in to next week's programme. So until then, I'll say, Diganafwy all, goodbye. That's in normal Cornish as opposed to Kernewek. But Diganafwy all, God be with you, until I see you next week. Diganafwy.